Hotep, I'm Dr. Gloria L, Peace, host and producer of OmniU Presents the H3O Art of Life show. The title of this show is called Revealing Revelations, and it is because we have someone in our studio who is a scholar par excellence, has been one for many years, almost too many to believe, and consequently has a lot of information that is not part of the mainstream of knowledge that I wanted to share with you. He will be a presenter in our series called What the Do You Know About? And I want to greet Professor Josef Ben Levi, just to tell you how much I respect and admire your scholarship and your dedication to your scholarship, because I'm sure that you could do a lot of other things with your time other than spend it in your own library as well as the libraries around the city.
Well, thank you very much, Dr. Peace. I'm always happy to be on your show and to share information with your audience. I've always been honored that you've always had me come out and speak all the way back when we're doing radio shows and stuff like that, and so it's always really nice. And I thought that I would address this topic because on Revelation, because there's a television program that just came out on this week called Revelation. The problem I have with that, and because of the significance of the influence of fundamentalist and evangelical Christianity, is that most people, when you talk about the book of Revelations, and you're talking about what they call the apocalypse, because the Greek word apocalypse literally means revelation, or literally to pull the lid off of something. That's what the word actually means, to pull the lid off of something. And most people don't know much about the book, and those who think they know about the book don't really deal with it. I know of very few ministers on a Sunday morning who even address the book of Revelations. Most people who look at the book of Revelation look at it as a bunch of mysterious symbols and stuff like that that they really don't understand. And so I thought today I would like to talk about really 3 or 4 things, if I can, time permitting. And one, that is the question of the book of Revelation, what it's all about, and for a little bit even to get into some of the things in the book of Revelations and its relationship mainly to the book of Daniel, because without understanding the book of Daniel, particularly the 7th and 8th chapters of the book of Daniel, you'll never really understand Revelations chapters 12, 13, and 14. The other thing I want to look at is, along with the history behind, the book itself, is the questions inherent when people look at that book related to the rapture, because there are people who believe that one day we're going to look up and some of us are going to be here and some of us are not going to be here. And a lot of that has been perpetuated by the work of LaHaye and the Left Behind series that he has put out there. And the other thing is the Antichrist. And the history behind the idea of the Antichrist. And one of the things I always try to introduce people to is the whole idea of epistemology. How do you know what you know, and how did you come to know it? Most of what we get from people who have been about some type of calling, or they have some idea that they got some great manifestation from somewhere out there, to have them go and, quote, preach the word of God to people without really understanding the historical background. And I'm not talking about those people who gone to school and got doctorates in divinity, who may have had done pastoral studies in which they basically are doing sociology and psychology work. But I'm talking about very few of them who've actually done serious scholarship and tried to actually go after the truth of this thing. And this is not to identify with the political institution I refer to as the church, or its various subsidiary organizations that developed after the Reformation. I want to deal with the real kind of historical stuff that's there. And of course, there's a whole lot to deal with, but I'm not going to, and I can't deal with all of it in this program. One of the things we want to look at is that the book of Revelations basically deals with the period of time between the destruction of the Second Temple, which was destroyed by Vespasian, who was the son of Nero, in 68 of the Common Era. In 68 of the Common Era, and Josephus does an extensive work on this, so I'm not going to go into a whole lot of detail except to tell people they want to know about what happened to the second temple that was set at Jerusalem that was under Herod. Then they need to read Flavius Josephus's complete works, what he called the War of the Jews, and his argument against the Roman historian Appian. Now, that period of time also had to do with the approach of the development of Christianity as we come to know it. And I always like to point out to people that the man that they called Jesus was not a Christian. The idea that Jesus was a Christian, because people refer to him as Jesus Christ, like my name is Josef Ben Levi, and as I've said several times before on this program, that his last name was not Christ. That Christ, or Christo, is a word which means anointed. And anointing merely means to pour oil upon. The original word for that in Hebrew, Mashiach, also means to be anointed, to pour oil upon, because that was a ritual that was performed when the person became king. Whether it was Saul, or whether it was Hezekiah, or King David, or Solomon, or whoever it was, they all became Mashiach. They were all messiahs because they all had this ritual performed on them. Now, when we go back and look at some of the early history, we see that Augustine, whom is called Saint Augustine, Augustine of Hippo, and of course Augustine was an African thinker. It is from Augustine that, along with his argument from Pelagius, that we get the idea of original sin. See, people think the idea of original sin came from some experience that was supposed to happen in the so-called Garden of Eden in the book of Genesis, where Adam got together with Eve and was supposed to have eaten some apple, and nowhere does it say that they ate an apple. But the idea is that they're supposed to have eaten an apple, and consequently this was an introduction to the idea of the original sin. Whereas I like to point out to people, if they ate an apple, why did they cover their private parts and not their mouths then? So it's apparent that they didn't eat an apple. And it's clearly said that they took fig leaves and covered their private parts up. So Augustine came up with this, but Augustine was also the one who came with the idea of putting the book of Revelations at the end of the New Testament canon. And when I talk about the canon, I'm speaking about that group of literature and what we now know as the New Testament that are the 27 books that were decided upon to be the books to be put in this book, in this material that the Greeks refer to as the Koine Diatheke, or what is translated as New Testament. But it was his idea to put it at the back, at the end of the book of the Bible. And on top of that, he argued that the book of Revelation, when he talked about the 1,000 years or the 1,000-year reign of Christ, his position was that this was the church that they were talking about, that this didn't have anything to do with some future event. And one of the things I want to show in relation to the book of Revelation, that the book of Revelation was not dealing with events that would happen in the future, but dealing with events that were happening in their lifetime, under their personal experiences. And so it so happened that in the 3rd century, that this was the 100th the 1000th anniversary of the year of the existence of the Roman Empire, or the existence of Rome. And so that was viewed as this 1,000-year reign that had actually occurred. And so some people thought that that's what Revelation was talking about. But what Revelation really is an attempt to interpret information that comes from the apocalyptic literature in the book of Daniel. Because without understanding the book of Daniel, one cannot understand the book of Revelations. And next, without understanding ancient history, you cannot understand the symbolism that is written in the book of Daniel, or for that matter, in the book of Revelations. When they're talking about, which I'll get into a little bit later on, when they talk about the 4 beasts rising up out of the sea, and the sea is trouble. Well, this is a disturbance is going on, that there's confusion, there's trouble out there. They are diverse one from another. It talks about in the book of Revelation, because they were 4 different types of nations. And then they begin to describe these various nations. One coming up looking like a lion with eagle's wings, another one coming up looking like a bear, the other one coming up looking like a leopard, the other one coming up looking like a lion. All of these things, or with these iron teeth, all of these things are actually history hidden in symbols. And in order to really understand it, you really have to understand ancient history and how this ancient history came about. So, in 68, around 68 of the Common Era, Nero passed away. Nero died. And of course, the way the story goes, he got drunk and he went up on top of his roof and he fell off the roof and broke his neck. Well, Nero is the beast that is referred to in the book of Revelations, Nero Caesar. The translation of the Greek word Nero Caesar, if you look at the language, Hebrew and Greek and Latin, all of the letters of the alphabet are also numbers. So when we translate Nero Caesar from into Greek, it comes out to be 1005. But when we translate Nero Caesar into Hebrew, it comes out 666. And so he was the beast that they were talking about. As far as I'm believing that this is going to be some individual that's going to appear at some point in time in history, that was the individual they were talking about, because Nero was an individual who was beginning to persecute Christians. Now, this persecution kind of moved on under his son Vespasian when he destroyed the temple in Jerusalem, but it didn't have any so much to do with Christians as it had to do with the revolts that were taking place in the land of Israel. They had the Bar Kokhba revolt, because Bar Kokhba was viewed by the ancient Hebrews at that time as being the Messiah. That was part of Bar Kokhba, and there were several others who they thought were the Messiah, the son of David, returned back on earth again. Among the Maccabees are spoken about in the book of the Apocrypha to the Old Testament. Some of them, John Hyrcanus and some of them, were also considered to be some of these Messiah types. So there are many, many others who were basically thought to be Messiahs, and all of them got wiped out. Every single one of them. So, but Daniel was not written until about 250 of the Common Era. So Daniel was written almost 200 years after the events that Daniel is talking about. And what we have to understand when we look at a person who is a so-called prophet, the prophet is basically your newsman of the time. However, more specifically, when we're looking at this newsman of the time, this newsman is more like a Monday morning quarterback, because the game has already been played. The outcome has been established, and what he is doing is basically talking about what happened at the game on Sunday, all right, and writing it out. Now, the book of Revelation is believed to have been written by John. Now, there are several Johns, and we don't know who any of these Johns are, or whether they were true John. This particular John, whom they describe, who was exiled on the island of Patmos, which was a Greek island, was supposed to have been the writer of the book of Revelation. However, the problem is that this John was not an apostle. Now, if this John is supposed to be the brother of James, the son of Zebedee, the problem with that is that that particular John and that particular James and that particular Zebedee were all killed by Herod Agrippa in the year 44 CE, so he couldn't have possibly wrote the book of Revelations in 66 CE, because he wasn't there. But what Christians did, what the Christian church did, was made the statement that John lived to be 100 years old to justify why the book was written so much later. So that, you know, that was a bunch of really fruitless and stupid stuff. Now, so when we look at the idea of the book of Revelation and we look at the apocalypse, what we begin to see is that in the book of Revelations, they talk about the great Babylon. All right? Babylon the Great. Babylon is falling. Well, they were talking about that because there were two nations that destroyed Jerusalem. First, the ancient Babylonians under Nebuchadnezzar in the year 586 BC, who destroyed the first temple that Solomon built at Jerusalem. And then the Romans, who destroyed the second temple under Herod in the year 68, or sometime what they call 70 AD, 68 or 70 AD, depending on how they want to play with the numbers. That was the Rome that they were referring to. That was Rome that destroyed the second temple at that time, but that was also the ancient Babylon analogy that they were making. Now today, a lot of people will make the same analogy and claim that, well, the United States is ancient Babylon, and Babylon is falling and is falling. Well, that's real beautiful if we want to use allegory. But it has been clearly shown that in 100% of the instances in which people have suggested that these events that they were talking about to occur were going to occur so much later on in history, particularly in this particular time in history, in modern history, that all of those events failed. None of them happened like people said they were going to happen. Next, there's the problem of the calendar. The calendar problem comes up because we know that Pope Gregory established the calendar, the Gregorian calendar that we use today. Well, Dionysius Exiguus, or Dennis the Little, as they sometimes called him, miscalculated Herod's birthday by 4 years. So that if we wanted to give an example, we could say that, for example, while this is recognized as the year 2005, this is actually the year 2009. Because he was miscalculating the date because he wanted to set this particular date for the birth of Jesus. So what most people fail to realize is that while this is the year 2005 in the Gregorian calendar, this is not the year 2005 in the Hebrew calendar, or for that matter, any other calendars that were around in existence at that time. This is a construct that has been developed in the European world, so that when people start using this particular calendar to do all these calculations for the so-called end of the world, and they wonder why they get thrown off. They wonder why, for example, in the year 1999, when people were standing around waiting for Jesus to return in the year 2000, that nothing happened. Which is the same thing that people were doing in the year 999 when they thought that Jesus was going to return in the year 1000. And when it didn't happen then, the church had to change its story. So now there's a new movement now within the church to talk more about spirituality and to try to identify what spirituality is, even though no one can know what it is, and people are still going and getting these allegorical analysis, as I like to call them, in the church on Sunday, you know, where any minister going to talking about Matthew, Mark, Luke, or John if they're in the Baptist church, because they deal with the synoptics, and they call synoptics because Matthew, Mark, and Luke tell similar stories from different vantage points. And if you line them up side by side, you see the very similar story, but then they're also saying different things. Or you got the case of the others, such as the apostolics, who are working with the writings of Paul, and Paul never knew Jesus. Which, according to the story, Paul met the spirit of Jesus on the road to Damascus. Paul never talks about the birth, you know, what they call the nativity story. Paul never talks about the crucifixion. None of those types of things, or what happened in the Garden of Gethsemane, he never discusses any of those types of things because he didn't know any of those types of things. And he was really talking about some other kinds of issues because of the dispute that he was having with the people who were running the Christian system in Jerusalem, in the land of Israel. He was doing this thing out there with what they call the Gentiles. And as I like to point out to people 100,000 times, that when Paul went and spoke to the Gentiles, he tells you who he spoke to. He spoke to the Colossians, the Ephesians, the Thessalonians, the Romans, and so forth. And those were the Gentiles, and all of those were Europeans. So it's apparent that African people could not be Gentiles since we're not Europeans. And since we know that Paul went and spoke to them, as I like to tell people, all you got to do when you read Ephesians is ask yourself, where's Ephesus? And look on a map and find it. You know, because unfortunately, we in the United States are the most geographically illiterate people in the world. We don't know where anything is. We halfway know where Iran and Iraq is over there today. So that in order to understand a lot of this history, we really have to go back and study ancient history. Now, one of the other things that happened is that when Constantine became emperor of the Holy Roman Empire in 313, it was believed then that the church could not possibly be the Great Babylon, because the emperor had accepted Christianity as the religion of the empire. And since it was the religion of the empire, how could it therefore be the evil empire? And so what Eusebius and his church histories did was wrote this information and said, well, you know, obviously the church cannot be this evil empire, this evil entity, because look, Constantine accepted Christianity. But no, he didn't accept Christianity. He was very lenient toward Christians, but Constantine continued to practice all of the so-called pagan practices that he had practiced, and he was one of the most vicious, low-down, thuggish killers that ever existed in the history of the world. And then on his deathbed, he accepted Christianity, for hoping then that it would, you know, take him and get him up into into heaven, some kind of way, wherever heaven might be. So, so with that in that context, let me look at let's look at Revelations. We see that in Revelation 6, it talks about the four horsemen, what they call the four horsemen of the apocalypse. All right, you got the first one, who is on the white horse for conquest, the red horse for war, the black horse for famine, and then the pale white horse for pestilence. Now, people will say that, well, you see, all these things are happening because in the book of Matthew, the 24th chapter, it says, you know, all these things must, you know, that this generation shall not pass, and so forth, shall not go until all these things come to pass. Well, the problem with that is that all these things have already been happening in the past. We've already had tons and tons of wars. There's still war going on out there. We've had many, many types of pestilence. We had the Black Death during the Middle Ages. We got AIDS out there now. We've had polio. We've had all types of pestilence that have occurred. We had the great dust storms that occurred in this country that wiped out crops in this country over the years, and have happened in many other places all over the world. But nobody has looked at the fact that these things have occurred over. Earthquakes have been going on for years, everywhere. The tsunami that they just had out there happened because of an underground earthquake. We have a fault right here in Southern Illinois, where earthquakes occur right here in this city. But people would say, well, you see, all these things are manifestations of the end of the world. Well, it never says that the world is going to end, because it doesn't use the word mundo. It uses the word aeon, which means the end of an age. And so the end of an age occurs astronomically every 25,000 years. As we move from one age to the next, we move from the age of Pisces into Aquarius, into Aries, and so forth and so on. Well, this happens every 25,000 years, what they call the Great Year. But even when that happens, there's no major destruction that occurs to wipe out all the civilization as we have come to know it. All right, now, the other thing that I want to look at, and I want to just hit on some things, are, for example, when we look in Revelations, where it talks about breaking the sixth seal, and it talks about the coming together of the righteous 144,000. Now, most Christians will say that the righteous 144,000 are the righteous saints of the church. But it doesn't say that, though. It says that these are 144,000 of the 12,000 from the 12 tribes of Israel. That's what it says. So these 144,000 are going to be 144,000 of the returning of the children of Israel. However, the other side of it is that when you break 144,000 down mathematically, it comes to the number 9. And the number 9 was the symbol of a man, and this was a symbol of man removing himself from his from all the evils and wrongs that occurred in his life. So a lot of that is there's a lot of symbolism in the numbers that exist all throughout the scriptures that a lot of people overlook. So no, it's not going to be 144,000 Christians marching into the land of Israel to establish themselves in the kingdom of God with Jesus at the head. It doesn't even say that, but that's the imagery that's occurred because of the idea that the church is the spiritual Israel. You know, it's very funny to make the church the spiritual Israel when we got people who are the children of Israel, whom they call the black Jews, all over the world. I mean, the History Channel just recently did a thing on the Limba people of South Africa, whom they found out genetically are supposed to be direct descendants of Moses. But like the man in the Limba said, among the Limba said, they claim that we the lost tribes of Israel. We're not lost, we right here. And we always been right here. Or the people that they call the Falasha, many, many others that have existed. But of course, that takes us into another question about, well, okay, if all those people are there, well, then who are those people over in the land of Israel who claim to be the Jews? But that's a story for, that's a discussion for another program all by itself. But a discussion which, you know, I'm more than glad to talk about, because, you know, there's a story to tell on that end too that has not been told to people. And unfortunately, when we have people going and see the Passion of the Christ and stuff like that, believing in their mind that this is exactly how it happened. That's not how it happened. And as I said in a previous show, that was Mel Gibson telling his version of it. And that's what he said. This is my interpretation of that story. And the only two things that were really good in that story that Mel Gibson actually did was, number one, the people spoke Aramaic, which is what they spoke. And that's very funny, because since the people spoke Aramaic during Jesus' time, why is the book written in Greek? Secondly, the Romans spoke Latin, and they were speaking Latin in there, which was really good. But then the New Testament is written in Greek. So there's a whole problem for discussion right there in and of itself. The other thing we see is in Revelations 12, it talks about the archangel, Michael, or as is written in Greek, Michael. Michael really is the representation of the symbol for Mars. Now check this out. Now, Mars is fighting against the great Satanas. The Satanas is Venus. So then we get men are from Mars, women are from Venus. So, you know, there's a play there that a lot of people don't really look at, even though also there speaks about the great dragon, right? The great dragon, the great beast that occurs. Now, a lot of this also had people who probably don't know have never looked at the book of Enoch in the pseudepigraphical works to the Old Testament, because the pseudepigraphical works to the Old Testament deal with a lot of the imagery and stuff that we find in both Daniel and in Revelation. Many of the people have probably never looked at the great war scroll from the text of Qumran, what they call the Dead Sea Scrolls. In the war scroll from Qumran, we read about the war between the sons of light and the sons of darkness. But these ideas of this division, this war between the sons of light and the sons of darkness, is really based on Zoroastrianism. The Zoroastrian belief system, which comes out of Iran, ancient Iran, is where we find this war between evil and good. Prior to then, it didn't exist, because we didn't have a concept of evil, because they in the Old Testament times, of which when in the New Testament they speak about the scriptures, they're referring to what we call today the Old Testament, which they didn't call the Old Testament, since it wasn't called the Old Testament. And as I pointed out to many people before, nowhere in the Old Testament is it called the Old Testament. So where did that idea come from? All right, of what they call in Greek the Palai Diatheke, right, which they call the Old Testament, versus the Koine Diatheke, which is the New Testament. It's called Tanakh, as I pointed out before in this show, because it is not a name of a book, but a description of, it's an acronym for the divisions of the book into the Torah, the law, the Nevi'im, the prophets, and the Kotavim, or the writings. And so it's called Tanakh. But, you know, a lot of people look at it and say, well, you know, this is the Bible, and everything in here is the Word of God. No, it is not the Word of God. They say, okay, well, this is the inspired, the men who were inspired by God to write this. No, it's not men inspired by God to write this. It is just the words of some men, period. Because, you see, God is such that God don't need nobody to write anything for God, because that's what made God the Most High God. You see what I'm saying? We don't need men to do that type of thing, but men were writing the history, and as I point out to people, they're writing the history of a group of people that had lived during their time and their experiences with other peoples during their time and their relationship with the idea of creativity as they understood it. It wasn't written for the whole world, the rest of the world, the black world, or quote, the white world, the Oriental world, the Hispanic world, or no other world. It was written for them in their world and what they were dealing with at that time. So this had to do with war in the sky, the war between the sons of light and the sons of darkness. And so this was an invective against Rome. Now, in the Ocarinus papyrus, which was a fragment of the book of Revelation, which was found in Egypt, the beast number is 616, not 666. So now we got another problem. Is it 666 or is it 616? Because if it's 616, that's 13, all right? Which then 1 and 3 is 4, all right? So 4 has a particular value. So what is it? Is it 666 or is it 616? All right, and some of the earliest fragments show it as 616. So that is a problem. Now, let me speak on the Antichrist. Antichrist literally means against the Christ, not against Jesus, against the Christ. And as I point out to people, that the Christ is a theoretical construct. Nobody ever deals with the historical Jesus. Did the man really exist? If he existed, when did he exist? What did he do while he was alive? All right? A lot of people say, well, he was the son of a carpenter, that he was a carpenter. But the Greek word technoi does not mean carpenter. It means an artisan. He could have been a shoemaker, a blacksmith, or anything, but not a carpenter, because technoi does not mean carpenter. Mm-hmm. So how did that idea, you know, this is also one of the powers of the language, because language, we can go in and we can explore the thing for ourselves, and we can really see what it really say, and say, that's one of those things Arsenio said, used to say, make you want to go, you know? And so, the whole idea of the Antichrist, as it relates to the rapture, is a very funny thing, because we only first off hear about the notion of the rapture in 1 Thessalonians in the 4th chapter, where it talks about the people being swept away in the twinkling of an eye. Well, the Greek word artagamos literally means to plunder, all right, to spoil, to take away as an object of evil. So I'm not quite so sure when people read that if they really understand what it means. And on top of that, the whole idea that that this particular thing would occur, there's no historical evidence of that. There's no scriptural evidence of that. It was just something that was created. Now, and I want to track, you know, kind of get back to that if I can within some time. Now, there was a guy by the name of Montanus. Montanus was a one who had this belief system, and he lived in the latter part of the 2nd century, and he believed that the world was coming to an end based on a massive plague of smallpox that they had at that time. So he thought for sure that the world was going to come to an end, and he believed that Jesus was going to come and institute the 1,000-year reign of peace. Now, for me, it's mighty strange that he already do 1,000 years of peace. What about all them other thousands of years that we're going to have before and after that? Mean that we're going to have just 1,000 years of peace? There's something up with that, all right? So, but the first time we hear about this idea of the Antichrist is from a French monk by the name of H3O. H3O writes in a very famous letter to the Queen of France, in which he talks about the whole idea of this Antichrist who was going to be born of a woman. And this was something that they made up, since there's no scriptural evidence of something called the Antichrist. Later on, we find, skipping over some things, just getting down to William Miller. Now, William Miller is a very important individual, because William Miller argued that the book of Revelation hadn't been fulfilled, and this was here in this country. And so he came up with the idea that there would be these various dispensations of time. And within these dispensations, he came up with an idea through a lot of calculations that the world was going to come to an end in the year 1843 or 1844. Well, then when it didn't happen in 1843, 1844, he recalculated again to the year 1856. Well, then it didn't happen then. And man, during this time, people were selling all their stuff. They were moving up on some mountain somewhere, waiting for Jesus to return to take them up into the sky. When this didn't happen, he had to rethink his whole thing. Now, out of the Millerite movement came the Seventh-day Adventists. As a branch of the Seventh-day Adventists, we have Jehovah's Witnesses. And as I always like to tell people, you know, when I see people who are Jehovah's Witnesses on the street or trying to sell me their magazine, I always like to go through it and ask them, you know, I notice there are no black faces in here among the biblical people. And why so? You mean tell me that you believe that all these people at that time were all whites, so that by a very subliminal suggestion, you are being convinced into the worship of whites as your God? And that's a very, very dangerous kind of idea. And then I always like to ask them, the next question is, when did they allow African Americans to get into the Jehovah's Witnesses? When did that occur? You know, which for a long time, they did not allow blacks in Jehovah's Witnesses for a very long time. And when it finally did occur, most were relegated to some very low positions. It's sort of like what's happening in the Mormon church now, you know, even though the Book of the Mormon says some very negative things about black people, you know, blacks are now being allowed into the Mormon church so they can go ahead and talk about their, you know, and be a part of it. So, in the 15th and 16th centuries, a strange thing was occurring in the church. There was conflict occurring. This conflict happened because of people who were reformers, mainly people like Martin Luther, John Calvin, and several others who didn't like what was going on in the church. So these reformers got together and they said that the church was the Antichrist and that the Pope was the beast that was sitting on the throne that sat on the 7 hills. Now, what the church did to counter the reformers was that they called a meeting at the Council of Trent, And in 1690, they had a Jesuit priest by the name of Francisco Ribera write a book on prophecy that dealt with futurism. Well, these futurism ideas had to do with the fact that the church, they said, was not the part of the Antichrist or the beast and everything, but that these events that were talked about in the book of Revelation weren't going to happen until much, much later on in the future, in the last 7 days of time. That's where they came up with it. So what happened is that 300 years later, this idea of futurism caught on, and what happens, you had a Irish lawyer who became an Anglican priest by the name of John Darby. Now, John Darby actually is the one who became the father of the doctrine of the rapture in this country. And this happened in the 19th century, so we're talking about the 1800s. And he believed that Jesus would secretly return to earth one day, you know, and take up certain people, and then come back again for those who are left and have a battle with the Antichrist, and then take the other people away. Now, and this would only happen during what they call the 7-year period in which all of the disasters and the drama and everything that were gonna occur on earth. Then Jesus would return and pick up the rest of us and take the rest of us somewhere to heaven, wherever that might be. All right. Even though the earliest thinkers, the earliest Christians, when we go back to people like the community at Qumran, and you had and of course the Gnostics, who all acknowledged the fact that heaven wasn't out there in the sky. That heaven was right here. Heaven was right here on earth, and that you had to find who you are and find God within you. You couldn't find it out there. You couldn't find it. You couldn't look for it in the sky or look for it in the over here, over there, because it was right here with you. It was everywhere on earth, because this is where it is. You can't go up to the sky and find it. And so the imagery, of course, that we have of people being in the clouds and being in the sky and God doing all these other types of things with angels' wings and all this other kind of stuff, basically comes from the iconography of the Middle Ages. Because we have to remember that people couldn't read or write. So since people couldn't read or write, they used to draw pictures for them. And unfortunately, we still have people looking at pictures in their Bibles to tell them the story, you know. And they thinking that Noah walked into the ark with the animals 2 by 2, and that's not how it went. He went into the animal with only 2 of the unclean animals and 7 of the clean animals. That's how it says that. Or as I heard one student tell me this past week, she said that her pastor told her that even if she don't come to church, she need to make sure she sent her tithe. And I told her, I said, you know what? The tithe has the word itself means a tenth. All right? And what it had to do was the tenth of the increase of the land for the upkeep of the temple. Now, your church is not the temple. And if the minister is going to have you keep the tithe law, then I'm sure that the minister is going to help you keep the law of purification in the book of Leviticus 13 or 14, when it says when a woman comes on her menstrual cycle, she's not supposed to go near the temple or sleep with her husband. I'm sure he's going to have you keep the dietary law of Leviticus 11, which says you should eat pork and certain other things. These are the things you shall not eat. And I'm sure there's some other things that he's going to have you keep if he's going to do that. But then they say that, of course, Jesus did away with the law, even though, if I remember correctly, I heard him say, I did not come to destroy the law, but to fulfill it. And so, and that he used to go into the synagogue as was his custom, so that I know he used to worship on the Sabbath day and not on Sunday. So it's a whole lot of stuff that if people want to be, but then I can understand that, because that's when you follow in the Christ and not the historical Jesus. Because to follow the historical Jesus and to do what the Jesus did, if he existed, and I confirm that he didn't, but just for the sake of argument, to follow the Christ, then you follow on a mythological construct, so you can make anything out of it you want to make out of it. You can believe whatever you want to believe about it, do whatever you want to do with it, change it however you want to change it, make up stories however you want to make up stories, that's fine. But if you start looking at the historical Jesus thing, then of course we get into other issues like, you know, Mary Magdalene and stuff like that, and whether Mary Magdalene was his companion or not. And what do we mean by companion? That was his lady friend. And I know some people don't like to hear the fact that Jesus Christ had a lady, because we have found it hard to believe that the Son of God, supposed Son of God, when a lot of times we read about the Son of Man. All right? Son of man don't mean son of God. People might read son of man and think in their mind son of God, but it says son of man. That he actually had a woman? Of course he had a woman. In the Gospel of Philip, and all this stuff is really coming out now, but it's all been out there for a long time, just being popular now, where, you know, the apostles go to Mary and say, you know, go to Jesus and say, Master, why do you kiss her in the mouth? And he says, shoot, what did I love to all of y'all? Could kiss y'all all in the mouth like this. All right, now, in those days, you didn't kiss another woman like that in the mouth unless she was something real special to you. And the fact that she was real special to him is very difficult to deal with. That's because the church has created a position and an idea of that women have no role in the church, when in fact in the earliest times women had major roles. They had major roles. There's some idea that even that this woman Mary of Magdala actually wrote the book of John. And the fact that this Mary woman was a very significant person, considering the fact that, you know, when he supposedly came out of the tomb at the so-called resurrection, guess who was standing there waiting on him? Mary Magdalene, or Mary of Magdala, which is what you would call Mary, that's where she was from, the city of Magdala. All right, she was there, which seems very logical to me. I mean, I think if something happened to me, I expect my woman to be out there waiting on me when I step out. And that's what she was. The other idea was that she was a prostitute. Well, there's no evidence that she was a prostitute anyway. That was something that, again, Pope Gregory made a statement about, because they're trying to suppress the idea of women in the church. And then over time, it took them 1,500 years until about 1996, where they finally came out and said, well, you know what, she really wasn't a prostitute. You mean to tell me nobody's read that she wasn't one? Nobody looked in the book and saw it and never said that? So it's little stuff like that. But quickly here, we got a little bit more time left. I want to break down some stuff from the book of, this is Daniel the 7th chapter. In Daniel the 7th chapter, in the first verse of Daniel, it talks about in the first year of Belshazzar. Now Belshazzar, who was one of the kings of Babylon, who was the first son of Nabonidus, who was one of the co-regents in Babylon, Daniel has this dream. And in this dream, he sees the 4 winds stirring up, all right, and 4 beasts coming up. These are 4 different nations. And the first beast he talks about as a lion. The lion is the symbol of ancient Babylon, because ancient Babylon, the symbol of ancient Babylon was the lion with wings on his back. And you can go down to Oriental Institute and see the statue of Sargon down there. It's the image of the lion with the wings on his back, because that was their symbol. Where it talks about that he had eagle's wings, and that meant also that this particular nation was a very swift nation in terms of how they attacked and how they conquered people. It says, but the wings got plucked off, and that it was pointing out that as time went on, the days of their conquering were going to end. And so next came up a bear. All right, another image came up like a bear, where a bear was the Medo-Persian Empire, because the Medo-Persian Empire destroyed the Babylonian Empire. And under Cyrus and Darius. Then it talks about that when they talk about the bear, that there were 3 ribs in this bear. Well, the 3 ribs represent 3 of the Persian kings, who were Cyrus, Ahasuerus, and Darius. Those were the 3 kings that the 3 ribs represented. And it said they went out and they would devour much flesh, because they went out and they destroyed all of the kingdom of Babylon. Then the next one it talks about came up as a leopard. Well, these were the Greeks, because the Greeks under Alexander defeated the Medo-Persian Empire to take over the whole world. And what happened is they talks about that this particular leopard had the 4 heads on it. Well, the 4 heads were 4 kings, because when Alexander died, he didn't leave a successor, but he divided his kingdom up among his 3 strongest rulers. And that was Cassander, who took over Greece. There was Lysimachus, who took over Asia Minor, Seleucus, who took over Syria and Babylon and Palestine, and Ptolemy, who took over Egypt. So those are what those 4 heads represented. Then there was a next one, the last one they said that was dreadful, that was terrible, that was more powerful than all the others, that had iron teeth. And this particular one was Rome, because when Augustus Caesar came into power, Rome became a real republic. Then Rome, under Augustus, Rome became the known power of the world. They defeated the Grecian Empire, and of course the Greek scholars became teachers of all of the Romans. And it said that it overthrew the residue of all the other nations that were left over. And those are all the nations that were in North Africa and the rest of Europe to establish what they call the Pax Romana, or the unified Roman Empire. And it said that this thing had 10 horns on it. Well, these 10 horns represent the unified Europe. Today, the 10 horns are viewed as the common market. Well, early on, we go back to the Middle Ages and see that represented Charlemagne, or Charles the Great, who unified Europe to establish what they then call the Holy Roman Empire. Well, today we see that as the common market, or the European Union, as they call it.
Yeah. We have 3 minutes.
Okay.
Can you quick hurry?
Okay, so one more. And then they talk about a little horn that came up. The little horn that came up was Antiochus Epiphanes, who set up the statue of Jupiter Olympus in the temple in Jerusalem. That was the image of the desolation and the desecration that occurred in the temple. So there's a whole lot of stuff here that can be broken down, and I could run this all down and say, yeah. So you see how the Babylon with the wings got plucked off. That was Great Britain, because its symbol is the lion with the wings on it. When the wings got plucked off, that was the United States of America. You know, and I could go and show out that the bear was the Russia, because that's a symbol of Russia, and so forth. So I could go and break down all those things to get the allegory. You see what I'm saying? But what we're really talking about is something that happened in ancient history. To allegorize it, to talk about something that's happening today, is beautiful, but when it blow up in your face, you can't get mad at the scripture. You got to get mad at yourself and for not telling people that this is just an allegory. This is not the real thing, because actually in ancient times, this is the way the thing went down. So for lack of a better thing, that's the kind of breakdown a little bit of the rapture and Revelation.
Well, I'll tell you one thing. You have revealed a lot of revelations up in here today. And of course, you're a part of our series, What the Blink Do You Know About? And I'm about to ask, what does anybody know about anything who has not studied deeply and who has not been willing to challenge themselves and the beliefs and ideas that most of us got before we knew that we got them. I'm very happy to see that you are a continuing scholar, that you're never going to just settle for what somebody else is giving you. Like you said, why didn't they look in the book and see that these things were not in there? And certainly you can't go around espousing things based upon some authority if the authority itself doesn't use those same things. You need a minute, go ahead and say some more.
Well, all I have to say is that I think that you know, I continue to study, you know, and I've been just studying. You know, some people read, I study, and I know there's a difference between reading and studying. And I try to share, because the things that I'm sharing are things that are available to anybody to find out if they want them. All they got to do is search.
Well, we're going to help them search, because we're going to bring you to them at some very near future date. And certainly we'll be here with you every Friday. Not always Josef Ben Levi, but very often we'll have him, and we'll be bringing you more information. Please write to us at our P.O. Box 1923, Madison, Illinois 60443. P.O. Box 1923,